Welcome to the University of Oregon iGEM team's second synthetic biology debate workshop. Today we'll be covering the basics of effective argumentation. Effective argumentation can be essentially broken down into two main groups. You have your presentation, or the manner in which you convey your information to your audience as well as the judges. And then you have your argument, or the actual information that you're trying to get across. With presentation, we'll be covering both the verbal and nonverbal aspects of communication. And then with your argument, we'll be talking about the introduction, moving on to the constructive/rebuttal speeches, or you can think of these as body paragraphs if this were an essay, and then wrapping up with the conclusion. To start, we'll discuss the presentation. Presentation is extremely critical in both public speaking, but especially debate. I'd say it's equally as important. It's nearly as important, if not equal in importance, to the actual argument that you're making. If, for example, if you have this perfect, well-supported, practically airtight argument that you want to make, but you present it in a way that is hard to understand, it's for nothing. Your audience won't be able to relate to your argument or support you, or nor will the judges start supporting you. When you think about effective presentation, one of the first things that probably comes to mind are filler words. These are words like oh, like. Anything that you say too frequently and doesn't add to your argument starts to become repetitive and detract from your argument. The second point is varied tone. A use of varied tone or changing in the speed and pitch of your voice as you're presenting something helps to inform your audience on how they should be receiving the information that you're providing. For example, you can say, this is an issue, this is who it's affecting, this is how it's affecting these people, this is what we need to do. That's much less effective than if you present it in a way like, this is the issue, this is who it's affecting, this is how it's affecting them, and this is how our plan hopes to solve this problem. It's much more engaging and inviting. Then moving on to the nonverbal aspects, eye contact. Eye contact is extremely important. It helps connect with your judges and audience, but also emphasize your points. Speaking further on emphasis, physicality. This can go for your entire body, but also your hands. You can use your hands to physically, spatially describe a hierarchy of ideas going from top to bottom. Or you can go from left to right to describe something that's sequential. Or you can use your hand to punctuate every single word that you're presenting on. It helps to, again, emphasize your point and draw your audience in. Now moving on to the arguments. With the introduction, there are three main things you want to keep track of: the inherency, inadequacy, and solvency. Inherency is where you try and prove that this thing is an issue. Inadequacy is this issue is not being addressed currently, or it is not being addressed sufficiently enough. And then finally, solvency. This is how the plan the affirmative is offering will solve this problem. And ideally, you have these lead into each other and kind of weave a narrative that will give your audience a bird's eye view of where you're starting, but also where you plan to go over the course of this debate. With inherency, we want to remember to include both the scope and harms. So to prove that this is an issue, we want to talk about who it's affecting and how it's affecting them. This will bolster your introduction. Next are your constructive/rebuttal speeches. The three things you want to keep, the three pieces you want to keep track of here are the evidence, the claim, and the topic. Your evidence is meant to support your claim, which in turn, a collection of claims supports the main topic. And as both a negative and affirmative speaker, you're able to attack your opponent's points at each point on this timeline, whether it's the evidence, the connection of the evidence to the claim, the connection of the claim to the topic, or the topic itself. And you can do this by using either on-case or off-case arguments. These are two categories of arguments. On-case arguments are arguing the point directly against the point that is being made. Off-case arguments argue around the circumstances of the case, of the point. For example, if you're arguing against your opponent's evidence, an on-case example would be, my opponent said this, however, we have evidence that counteracts that data. Our data is better, and it says this will be more effective. An off-case argument in this circumstance would be, my opponent said this, however, their evidence is poor. It's outdated, it comes from a disreputable source, it doesn't account for this specific circumstance. It's not applicable to our situation. If you wanted to attack your opponent's connection from the evidence to the claim, an on-case example would be, their analysis of the data is incorrect. You could say, their evidence says this, however, what their evidence says does not actually support their claim. They have inaccurately analyzed their evidence. If you wanted to attack their claim, an off-case example would be claiming that their claim is inconsistent with messaging from previous claims. For example, if you're in a debate about climate change and you're on the affirmative side and you are arguing as the affirmative that removing fossil fuel subsidies will benefit climate change, will decrease the amount of pollutants. The negative, your opponents, cannot argue both that the removal of fossil fuel subsidies will not be effective enough to spur any meaningful change. The fossil fuel companies will still keep drilling, keep polluting, whatever. You can't argue that it will both be ineffective and that the change brought about by the removal of fossil fuels will disrupt the fossil fuel companies, then cause them to collapse, and then by extension, cause the collapse of the economy. These arguments are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they require a lot of nuance to tie them together. Finally, for the conclusion, you want to keep the three main goals here are to rebut, restate, and relate. Rebutting in the sense that you want to rebut your opponent's most recent or most pertinent arguments, the arguments that you think are the biggest thorn in your side. You want to take these away from what your opponent has against you, because this is your last chance to say anything. This speech will be what the judges and audience leave the debate with. Restate. You want to restate your strongest arguments, the arguments you think will win you this debate, you think are most effective. And then finally, you want to round out your concluding speech by relating your arguments back to the topic, to the scope or the people it affects, and the harms, how it affects them. Again, this is the last chance that you have to say anything. So you want to leave your judges, again, back with that bird's eye view of what the core of your debate is, what the core you want the debate to be about, and then how they should feel about it. With that in mind, thank you for attending this workshop, and we hope to see you